Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you to the session called Russia-China Cooperation and the New Bipolarity. It is part of the World Order on the Brink series. And of course, one of the main reasons why the order is on the brink is that there is this emerging new bipolarity driven primarily by the Russia-China cooperation. So it's a topic of some importance. And we have an excellent panel today to discuss related issues. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Martin Hála, and I'm the founder and director of Sinopsis, a China-focused think tank here in Prague. To my left, Professor Charles Burton, our very own Sinopsis senior fellow, and also a prominent researcher and writer on the Communist Party of China and contemporary Chinese politics. Charles taught at Brock University in Canada, worked for the government, and did a lot of other interesting things. Next to him is Mr. Francisco Bencosme, a senior policy advisor and China policy lead for the United States Agency for International Development. Before working for USAID, Francisco worked for the government as the deputy to the special presidential envoy for Compact of Free Association negotiations in the Pacific Islands. And Francisco also worked for the Open Society Foundations and Amnesty International. Next to him, Professor Anne-Marie Brady, also our very own senior fellow at Sinopsis now, and we're very glad to announce it publicly here. She's a professor in political science and international relations at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And she's one of the to me at least, she's one of the foundational figures in academic research on the Communist Party of China. And she's written several, I dare say, pioneering words on this issue. So we're very happy to have her with us today. But she's also, apart from academic work, she's also been publishing widely for the mainstream media, from the New York Times all the way to Financial Times. And last but not least, Dr. Szu-chien, who's the Deputy Secretary General of the National Security Council in Taiwan. And before that, he worked as the Deputy Foreign Minister in the Taiwanese government. And he was also the president of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And in that capacity, he's a very old friend of Foreign 2000. So welcome. Welcome. We will have about 35 to 40 minutes for a discussion among ourselves, and then I would like to turn it to the audience for questions. So first, I have a tricky and rather loaded question for everybody here. Are we in a Cold War too?
I want to reply to that. So in East Asia, the Cold War never ended. And the architecture is still there, the strategic architecture that was set up by the US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the Secretary of State before him set up the hub and spokes series of alliances, which remained in place despite the change in Eastern Europe. So from China's point of view, the US containment strategy never ended, and the strategic environment in East Asia has not changed, and China is seeking change in the strategic environment. Would like to push the US out of the Asia-Pacific, and this is one of the biggest upheavals in our region. China didn't have the capacity in the Cold War, as Europe understands it, in the 50s and 60s when the regional architecture was established, but it does have the capacity now. And foreign interference and hybrid warfare is the main means to do so, as well as military shows of force, as Taiwan knows.
So I guess the Cold War never really ended in Taiwan, right?
So your question, is there a Cold War?
Cold War II.
Cold War II, yeah. Definitely. There's no doubt about that. And I think China's ambition, as well as its threat to our democratic camp, is greater than Soviet Union, because it occupies an economic power that Soviet Union never enjoyed. And along with that, China also reaches out through multiple channels and building its narrative dominance and also its political dominance in many international organizations. If we want to count the vote in UN, they will win. There's no doubt about that. And we all say that the democratic camp is competing with the authoritarian camp on the third camp, which is Global South. But in Global South, they have dominance. Inevitably, they have dominance. So the situation that our camp is facing right now is much worse than the Cold War. That's our perception, and the competition and confrontation between the two camps are much subtler than the Cold War. Cold War was mainly about ideological and pure military confrontation. But what we're facing nowadays permeates into more dimensions, including technological competition, which decides the future of our economic life. So from my perspective, it permeates every dimension. So it's a competition of civilizations.
Thank you. So in other words, not just Cold War II, but Cold War plus plus.
You may put it that way, yeah.
So how about Canada? Do people talk about Cold War II in Canada?
Not enough. I gave some evidence to a Canadian parliamentary committee that's considering the tariffs on electric vehicles. And all of the witnesses prior to me talked about the Chinese government subsidy of this sector. And so the trade unions for auto workers definitely wanted to see tariffs, and the steel manufacturers definitely wanted to see tariffs. But nobody except myself talked about the national security risk of Chinese EVs dominating the market for automobiles in Canada. I mean, I suppose one aspect would be the devastation of the Canadian auto industry, but from my point of view, really what trumps everything is all those cameras and sensors that are on the vehicles, and the fact that China doesn't allow Teslas to go anywhere near government facilities or military bases. But, the hybrid war is on, but I don't think the Canadians believe it could be happening. Even things like expansion of the BRICS and the possibility of Turkey joining doesn't seem to have much resonance in people's minds. And other aspects of Chinese preparation for possible kinetic war by infiltrating infrastructure is not something that's taken seriously by the political class or the population at large, despite the increasingly urgent warnings of security and intelligence agencies on this. So I think there's a Cold War II going on, but unfortunately we are just passive in the face of it for the most part.
Francisco, do you have a dissenting view?
A little bit more complicated view. So I think in the United States, we're clear-eyed about the challenge. I think from the beginning of this administration, our national security strategy said that the People's Republic of China is the only actor with both the means and the intent to reshape the worldview. Despite that, though, we reject any analogy for Cold War or Cold War 2.0. When we at USAID work on a development issue or in a country, we first prioritize the development priorities of that country. Countries don't want to be pitted in a geopolitical proxy war between the US and the PRC. And so our first priority is those development priorities. We think we can still advance US interests, work with partners and allies, while still maintaining clear lines of communication with the PRC.
Is it difficult to maintain that optimism?
I think we need to, right? I think the world depends on US leadership, on the fact that the rules-based international order upheld by our partners and allies to really contribute to that peace and stability.
Thanks. So I'd like to go back to Dr. Xi. You know, Taiwan sits rather uncomfortably just on the fault line between these two emerging blocks in the new bipolarity. And it doesn't enjoy the usual guarantees, security guarantees like membership in international organizations, membership in the United Nations, not even the widely recognized notion of statehood. And yet at the same time, everyone knows that it is vital to the security and prosperity of the rest of the world. So does it feel lonely out there? What can the outside world do to help in this situation without formal security guarantees?
Thank you. Not lonely in Prague, not lonely from 2000, but the way you characterize Taiwan, I have to say to some extent is very correct. In terms of formal international organizations, we're excluded from most of them, and we're not recognized diplomatically by most of the major countries in the world. This is probably one of the very few international forums I can wear the name of our national title, Republic China Taiwan, with my formal title of my capacity. But in terms of the significance of Taiwan to the rest of the world, however, has been more widely recognized by the major countries in the world. For example, in the summit resolution of G7 the year before last year in Hiroshima, the statement that the resolution has stated that the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait is indispensable to global security and prosperity. So the G7 countries recognize that not because all of a sudden they like Taiwan more, but because they recognize it's pertinent to their own national interests and economic security. They understand that more than half of the cargo shipping shipping cargoes in the world will pass through waters around Taiwan, and Taiwan produces more than 60% of the regular general chips and 90% of the global advanced chips. So usually people ask me, what if there's say like quarantine or blockade happening to Taiwan? What would you do? I ask around, what would you do? That will affect your economy too. That will impact the global economy. It's no longer only a Taiwan's issue, it's a global issue. And so, Martin, your question is, how should the world help Taiwan? Two things. First of all, before the two things, first of all, we have to make it clear what's the root cause of what we're facing today. It's not what China claims that it's China's domestic issue. Not at all. It's a global issue. So it has nothing to do whether we accept or recognize, so to speak, one China principle or accept China's mischaracterization of UNGA Resolution 2758. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the common future that we cherish together, the value that we pursue together. So, two things. What do we do to stop China from doing something that will ruin our common future and their own future too? Second, help Taiwan. So in Stop China, there are 5 points I would like to make, if you allow me. First of all, foremost, to deter China from their attempt to invade Taiwan militarily. Second, to prevent China from coercing other countries, including Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, and all other countries. Third, curb China's ambition to conduct malign influence to other countries, such as in the Pacific. Fourth, eventually we have to override China's dominance in global narratives. We have to promote our narratives, our value. Eventually, we have to force China change the trajectory of its development. Because eventually, its way of development will be detrimental to our world. So, 5 points to help Taiwan too. First of all, to protect Taiwan's democracy. We are in the front line of the competition of two camps between democracies and the dictatorship. Second, to support Taiwan's self-defense. We mean military self-defense. We have the determination to protect ourselves, but we need your help. Third, to boost Taiwan's resilience. We have to be resilient not only for our own sake, but for the world supply chain. Fourth, to work with Taiwan to jointly develop our economy together. Because we, Taiwan, is one of the most important manufacturing hubs for global ICT and semiconductors. Finally, to allow Taiwan to contribute and help the world to have meaningful participation to international community and organizations. So these are my suggestions.
Thanks, Szu-chien. That was very clear and very specific. I hope people are listening beyond this room also. So, Anne-Marie, the PRC has been pushing mightily into the Southwest Pacific as well in recent years, and I guess not least to position itself for possible future conflict around Taiwan. And the PRC has been gaining ground in that region. But do you see the kind of Russia-China cooperation even out there that we see in other regions?
Yeah, the issue is not about China's diplomatic presence in the region, although that does affect Taiwan's interests, of course, and there has been a diplomatic rivalry which made the Pacific Island Forum nations more of interest to China than they were until the 2000s with Chen Shui-bian presidency and the change in foreign policy under Chen Shui-bian. The issue is about China's growing military and intelligence presence in the South and North Pacific. And where we do see China-Russia military cooperation is in the North Pacific. So there have been quite a lot of military exercises. It's from 2005, I think, was the first one, and 2014 was really interesting because they had military exercises down near Vladivostok. And instead of going back down south to China, China went up and did the first ever freedom of navigation exercise up in the Aleutians, which is the entrance into the Arctic Ocean. And it was a deliberate signal. And a month later, there were some PLA Navy boats over on the Baltic side visiting Denmark and Sweden and Finland, and it was thought they were going to come back over the Arctic Sea route. Well, they didn't have the capability to do that yet at that point, but China has been growing the ice capability, and one of the big sticking points for China, which is very, very interested in the Arctic and Antarctic for military reasons, was Russia, and Russia was insisting on that China would use Russian icebreakers, and that was very, very expensive. And so when I was doing my China polar research, I used to say in the US, is there any way that the US could get on with Russia? Because you don't want to be at the pointy end of the strategic triangle. And there is no way, as long as Putin and Xi are alive, we're in the situation that we're in now. And we're in the very bad situation, the West and all the democracies, of being at the pointy end of the strategic triangle. So in the early 1970s, it was a strategic quasi-alliance between the United States and its partners and China against the Soviet Union. Well, it's all gone the other way now. And so we are seeing in the North Pacific, as I said, quite a lot of military cooperation between China and Russia, and then of course there's all the military cooperation with Ukraine and now North Korea. In the South Pacific, it's a bit of a different story, and it's really interesting. The Soviet Union really had several goes at trying to do what China is doing very successfully, as Dr. Szu has mentioned, across the Pacific. Soviet Union, did not have the resources that China has these days to establish a military and intelligence presence, and they did so in similar kind of ways, actually. They tried to do through fishing boats, which really had other objectives. They gave military planes, and they did a whole lot of and weapons, a whole lot of other deals, but they got pushed back, really, really pushed back by the US and Australia and New Zealand in the 1980s when the Soviet Union was trying different things. Because the issue is the island chains, and trying to find a chink in the island chains. But what China has done is using, first through aid, but China's aid is, there's been a lot of loans to some countries, which has caused a great dependency and an inability to say no to China. I'm thinking about Tonga particularly. But then there's been targeting of political elites, and for some governments who have their own agendas, China has helped them get what they want. So Solomons and Vanuatu, and even territories like New Caledonia, which is, it's on an agreed path to increased autonomy. What would happen after that is not yet known. And so certain groups in New Caledonia and in French Polynesia have been developing relations with China for their agenda, and China's got its own agenda in the Pacific. So, as I was saying before, in the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific is the most dynamic environment at the moment for this terrible strategic environment we're facing. When there's a hot war in Europe, there's a hybrid warfare in the Indo-Pacific, and that is a lot harder to deal with because it's below the threshold of kinetic warfare, and yet it has the same impact. And again, I come back to the frog in the pot analogy. The frog is thinking it's getting a bit warm in here, but our politicians, like in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and across the Pacific, they don't have the same level of threat that they can respond to as they did in 1939. Yeah. And our pacifist government in New Zealand, a Labour government, responded really fast, 180-degree turn after the Nazi invasion. So this is the problem of hybrid warfare, which Taiwan knows all about, is that it's really hard for partners to respond in the way they need to respond. And, you're seeing freedom and navigation exercise. That was a big deal for New Zealand when we sent our little boat going very slowly up through the Taiwan Strait. We can't go very fast, China, sorry. And the Australians and the Japanese were there as well. And you've seen some other countries do that. It's very symbolic, and it's not enough. So China and Russia, I think, of as a toxic relationship. They're frenemies. Russia does not like that China has the upper hand these days in this relationship. But this is our world. This is our reality. This is what we have to get our governments and our publics to face up to. And it's a hard one, but you don't want to wish a crisis on anybody, but maybe it's going to take some more crises to develop that same alacrity of response that our political classes had in 1939.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks for the longer historical view. And Francisco, so you're familiar with the North Pacific intimately, so to speak. So some of the maneuvering has been mentioned here. And you personally worked on the Compact of Free Association. So could that be a tool to slow down or even stop the onslaught from China and this new emerging bloc?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, I think the reason it's important to state that we have the Compact of Free Association much before sort of the rise of China. This is an agreement that the United States has had for since the end of World War II. So for over 40 years. And the reason this administration, and honestly the previous one as well, restarted these negotiations is because, one, the United States is a Pacific country, whether it's Hawaii, Alaska, and many of our diaspora roots. Two, our strategic interests are in the Pacific, whether it's transnational challenges like climate change, maritime interdictment, or the fact that the Pacific Islands have an important UN voting block. And then, so I think, the fact that this administration was able to sign and ultimately pass through Congress with bipartisan support, the compacts allow us to, one, cement our relationship with these three countries, but also ensure that there's U.S. leadership on issues of freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, but also be able to support the development of many of these countries in the Northern Pacific. And that's part of our larger Pacific Island strategy. So for the first time ever, the United States came out with a Pacific strategy separate than our Indo-Pacific strategy. We've been increasing our embassies. USAID has increased its footprint in the Pacific Islands. We announced the Partners for the Blue Pacific, so working with Australia, New Zealand, France, Canada, and other partners to really expand how we're working and sort of providing that offer to many of our partners in the Pacific Islands to meet many of their development challenges.
Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Just a little bit of historical context. So the compact states, that relationship came about through the US after World War II and the lessons learned of the terrible loss of life of US personnel and a desire that that was never going to happen again. So establishment of the US, the concept of the US defence line. And so China is responding to the World War II architecture, post-World War II architecture, as I was saying, the strategic setup in the Pacific has never changed, whereas it changed in Europe. And also, in addition to the US defence line, which was in the first and second and third island change, with third is Aleutians all the way down to Antarctica, the hub and spoke alliance was set up after the Korean War, when China sent 300,000 people's volunteers and to support the North Koreans. So again, that was a containment strategy. It was part of it was the domino theory, all of that. And Chinese foreign policy is like a massive aircraft carrier or container ship. It doesn't change course easily. So it's had an understandable objective to change that strategic architecture. And it didn't have the means for a long time, but it does have the means now. So that's the context there. And the US response to the compact state, I think the US has been focused on other things for a long time, which was very frustrating for the compact states. Right. So history is coming back, and people are remembering why there's that special relationship.
Right. No, I think the international community, unfortunately, has ignored the Pacific Islands for far too long. But the hub and spoke system has been brought up a couple times. I think what you've seen in the last couple of years is a transition from hub and spoke to more lattice work and regionalism. So for the first time, the president spoke at the Pacific Island Forum. There's a lot more emphasis on ASEAN, elevation of the Quad, as opposed to the hub with U.S.-Japan and U.S.-Korea. Now you have a lot more trilateral relationship. You saw that at the leaders level. You also have a trilateral summit with U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. So you're seeing more of these loosely informal groups within Asia supporting regionalism like ASEAN, Pacific Island Forum, but creating new ones like the Pacific, like Partners for the Blue Pacific, to really bolster the resilience of that Asian architecture.
That's good to hear and reassuring. Thanks. So, Charles, we've heard a bit here about the Russia-China cooperation in the Antarctic and Arctic, and that would be certainly something of concern in Canada. So how much is it discussed in Canada?
Again, not enough. A few years ago, China attempted to purchase a money-losing gold mine north the Arctic Circle. The gold mine had an outlet into the Arctic seas and was spitting distance from a NORAD installation. The indigenous people up there, of course, were very keen that the Chinese should buy it because they were paying well over price. Eventually, the government decided not to allow this purchase. But in general, I think there's concern about China's definition of itself as a near Arctic state, which it isn't, and the Russian claims on Canadian territorial waters as being international waters. A new institution is being formed in the Arctic to try and remove Russia. You know, with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the Arctic Council has become inactive. And, you know, the fact that Sweden and Finland are now members of NATO means that really all of the countries surrounding the Arctic seas are NATO members except for Russia. I think that I think from my point of view, there's concern that China could start to treat the Arctic as they've treated the South China Sea and come up with ridiculous and non-historical claims that, that China should be functioning very close to the land. And China's ardent desire to try and get some kind of port facilities in Canada and greater access to Canadian critical minerals up there that haven't been fully exploited is a big concern. And it's again the same issue, which is, does the government get it that they're currently sort of balancing it between, Chinese are prepared to invest in Canadian mines where we can't get other investment, and China is prepared to support areas that would be a benefit to northern development for indigenous people. It's a very sensitive issue, and maybe that's okay, or we can control it in some sort of way. But I think the other larger issue is the security issue with regard to the Canadian government. There's an ongoing foreign interference commission. I was recently contracted to write a report on what the next government should do in response to this commission. And really, Canada has an enormous diplomatic cohort from China. We have 3 times the number of Chinese diplomats as Australia, albeit Canada's bigger. We have 40 more diplomats in Canada than Britain does, which is smaller. It's been estimated that 70% of them are not involved in legitimate diplomatic function. So, we really should be reducing the diplomatic cohort. We need to get more investment in security and intelligence of levels of investment comparable to what China has with the Ministry of State Security and associated United Front proxies. We really need to get more openness with regard to Chinese activities in Canada, which are currently kept secret. The Foreign Interference Commission has complained that the Government of Canada is withholding thousands of documents that they should have access to.
Is that legal?
No. I mean, no. I mean, they were supposed to give the justice all of the documents because the commission is cleared. And then we have the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians that have been issuing reports to the government every year on concerns about government response to intelligence assessments. And they have complained that over the past years, the government has not been responding to these reports. They just issued a redacted version of one of their reports that says that there are 11 members of the Canadian Parliament who are under the influence of China in various ways, wittingly or unwittingly. The government is refusing to allow the release of the names. So there's an election coming up. It's possible that some people who are not among the 11 who are under suspect will be assumed to be, it's a two-way street. In other words, not releasing the names. The government's refusing to release the names pending investigation. And the investigation on the Winnipeg labs collaboration with the Wuhan Institute for Virology is still ongoing, although the two scientists were arrested in 2017. It's been an awful long investigation. So, I mean, clearly we have a serious problem at the upper levels of government with regard to reluctance to challenge China in any way. And we don't have adequate provision for what happens to parliamentarians and senior civil servants after they leave public service in terms of being the beneficiaries of foreign sources of money. So really, I think for a lot of politicians, if they don't get on a Chinese government list of being unfriendly to China, then good economic benefits can derive to them once they retire in their 50s. All of these things need to be addressed, and I think maybe the problem is more serious in Canada than most of the other G7 countries. But I think that issues exist, comparable issues exist everywhere, and there just doesn't seem to be the political will to do the right thing and initiate legislation to counter the Chinese threat.
I think you're right. The comparative issues do exist just about everywhere, but different places deal with them differently, right? Some in slower manner than others, and that seems to be the case of Canada.
Very slow.
Okay, thanks. So I think it's about time to open the discussion to the floor, to the audience. So are there any questions? I don't see very clearly from here because I have the light in my eyes, but I'll try to. Mr. Sangay.
Throw the mic.
I play basketball in school. Thank you very much. Been a lot of discussion was about hardware, and the military and hybrid war. But as Dr. Szu said, China is winning the narrative. But literally, they're winning the narrative not by buying off leaders nowadays, but through their propaganda machine. They're able to convince people, let's say, for example, Szu-chien. If you look at their Chinese government television network Facebook account, has 123 million subscribers. CNN has 30 million, BBC has 60 million, Al Jazeera has 27 million. If you combine these three, right? Still, Chinese government television network has more subscribers. Now, 8 to 13% of population in African countries watch Szu-chien. So, and then Xinhua News Agency has become a content seller or content creator for all the news media. So, at least, of course, there's hardware and hybrid war, all that. But these are the things. For example, Facebook is banned in China. Can we persuade Facebook, if they're banning you, why not there be reciprocity? And you can't have Facebook with Szu-chien, So can we do something so that the narrative, mechanism through which they dominate the narrative are Western tools? The Chinese diplomats use Twitter, but Twitter is banned in China, so on and so forth. So to control the narrative, we must control the mechanism which are mainly Western oriented. Yeah.
Thank you. Responses?
Thank you for that question. So I did mention foreign interference in hybrid warfare. So foreign interference, I've written quite a bit about that, and that includes propaganda or telling a good story of China is how the CCP talks about it. So targeting elites is one aspect, but the propaganda narrative is a really essential part of it. Why are people watching Szu-chien in Africa? Because it's free. It's free to air. And Australia was a really terrible thing happened in the Pacific a few years ago. The Australian government foolishly, when they were in a phase of cutting back, market liberalism, everything to the market. So they sold off their shortwave broadcast service in the Pacific. And a lot of people listened to shortwave broadcasts. And who bought the Australian frequency but China? And now Australian radio and television is playing catch up in the Pacific. And so is Radio New Zealand. and TVNZ, and they do offer some free-to-air content, but not enough across the Pacific. And so that's a real failing of our governments. They've had a very bad case of the Chicago School economics, and they cut back on public services. I can definitely say that for Australia and New Zealand, probably for Canada too, right? And so public goods have been underfunded for a very long time. Education is another one. I have been saying for 20 years in New Zealand that we need to invest in scholarships across the Pacific. We need Colombo Plan 2. And this is way before China started all the scholarships. And I remember in 2005 when China announced 2,000 scholarships to students in the Pacific, they had about 2 people a year taking up initially. No one wanted to go to China. It was going to take them years to learn Chinese before they'd go on to their studies. But now they do have a big take-up. And China's doing all this technical training too. And our governments are still talking about it. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier, the level of urgency is not there that there would have been if it was kinetic warfare. Because it's foreign interference, and hybrid warfare includes propaganda, includes a whole range of tactics, then our governments can carry on this same old behaviour of not putting the money into exactly, as you say, where people's hearts and minds are being influenced, or even if they don't completely believe China on the China stuff, particular narratives are shaping in the Pacific. For example, Japan's release of the Fukushima water after the nuclear accident from the earthquakes. China and Russia pushed a disinformation narrative about that, which had a big take-up across the Pacific. Actually, in New Caledonia, 4.5 months of riot, a near state of civil war, because of some things that French government did, particularly. But the narrative is very much a narrative that is one-sided narrative of what is going on there. It does not present the whole picture. And Russia, China, Azerbaijan pushing that, but helping to push that narrative and create it and turn it into an international narrative. So I agree with you, propaganda, information is very, very important. But sadly, to echo Charles's words, our governments are still not stepping up and doing what they need to do and putting their money where the mouth is. But they have been putting a bit of money in, and it's the US started back in 2018 with the GEC, started to put some money in. But my criticism on that is you are usually 10 years behind the rest of us in what you actually need to do. Like I saw one about gaming. There were some very niche things that have been done. And by the time the State Department works out that something needs to be researched, it's usually too late. So that's the problem with that fund, is it's very prescriptive. And my God, the political interference, if you get any of that money, I'll be discreet and won't tell you about something that happened to me. But it's not very good. So the US has put a little bit of money up, and it's been helpful. But the rest of our governments, it's too little and too slow, and it's quite dangerous.
Francisco, did you?
Yeah, maybe, I mean, I'll agree with a lot of what was said. The trend lines are very concerning. It's not just elite capture or just propaganda in sort of state media. It's the fact that the PRC is buying media, business media landscapes, entire property or the business sides of many of the journalists, particularly in Global South. It's the fact that where we are investing in some fellowships, thousands of journalists are going on junkets to all around China. So there's a asymmetrical advantage in terms of scale, and also to the fact that we believe in a free press. And so when we invest in journalism, it's because we we want it to be independent and sustainable democratic institution where the PRC can use what some scholars at this forum would call sharp power, and certainly use the coercive elements of their funds to really manipulate that tool for their own political propaganda. To that, the U.S. certainly has been investing in democratic resilience. The U.S. made a huge announcement at the Democracy Summit on the Public Interest Fund, which is a consortium of supporting investigative journalism. We're trying to support more local content as well as local pockets of regional independent media, but also acknowledging that media takes many forms. And so in many of our development missions, it's not only traditional media, but sometimes it's getting information out through the radio or informal media like blogging is certainly popular in certain parts of the world. And so really being able to showcase what the United States and partners and sort of the Bretton Woods system or the multilateral rules-based international order has delivered for development needs has certainly been challenging, but it's something we're increasingly acknowledging and trying to correct.
Thanks. Szu-chien, I think nowhere is the battle of narratives more intense than in Taiwan, right? So do you want to say a few words about the Taiwanese approach?
Yeah, it is indeed, actually it's everyday phenomena that we are trying to counter China's narratives. The tricky part is they play into our democracy. Just like Russia, China, is developing the strategy to pick up some narratives. Firstly, came from the opposition position in criticizing the government. Of course, that's very natural in a democracy. You always have criticism from the opposition as part of democracy. But they pick up some of the opposition narrative and then expand it, twist it, sometimes adding some disinformation or misinformation. Sometimes they hack into the government system and released that hacking document to the press, and and then as an ammunition for the opposition to criticize the government. They have tactics like that. So it becomes very difficult to deal with, especially in sometimes driving the wedge between Taiwan's relationship with partners, especially U.S. And other countries, and also undermining the public's trust or confidence in the government, especially in our military, especially during there is a Chinese maneuver. For example, early this morning, there was a maneuver from China, and there's tons of disinformation created in our media. So these are the things that we're countering every day. Another headache is TikTok. TikTok is not providing formal service in Taiwan, but the content of TikTok can be indirectly shared through other platforms, and they're exploiting our freedom of speech, and so it's very difficult to create a legal regulation that can be equally applied to other platforms, that you can really stop the content of TikTok from circulating. So these are all the challenges. And TikTok, they manipulate their young audiences, and then sometimes during the peacetime, ordinary time, they feed them entertainment content, but gradually they manipulate how they see things. So these are all challenges we deal with. However, I think the best strategy is to compete their narratives with our positive narrative. Because, we're racing with their narratives in our own democracy, and the best way is to promote our own democracy, positive narratives about our own democracy. And you have to, this is what President Lai is trying to achieve in his recent National Day speech, that is to create a greater domestic unity. I know this is not easy because you have to find the commonality between the ruling party and the opposition party. In Taiwan, opposition party right now enjoys the majority. So you have to create that to consolidate our unity under our democracy. And the commonality is nothing else but democracy itself. So you have to consolidate people's confidence in democracy, and that will be the best way to counter China's narrative.
Great, thanks. So, Charles, you sometimes look like the lone warrior in Canada in the information scene, so do you want to say a few words about that?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing, pretty obvious, is it's not reciprocal. In other words, we have no access to trying to shape narratives inside China. I think the other aspect, which I agree with all of you on this point, but the Chinese disinformation narratives are much more appealing than the truth. Canada, much as you said, a couple of years ago, decided to unfund the Radio Canada International Mandarin service. And I used to appear on that speaking in Chinese, thinking that I could, correct narratives domestically in Canada to people who might listen to Radio Canada International Mandarin service. So I don't think anybody listens to it. And I mean, nobody, it seems that I know of, reads the simplified Chinese character version or traditional Chinese character version of the New York Times. The media that appeals to persons in Canada who like to consume Chinese media is just much more appealing to them than the truth. So it is it is a significant issue, and there is no media left in Canada, Chinese media, which is not under the control of Chinese narratives, except for the Falun Gong Epoch Times that has a unreliability problem and associated with an extreme political right-wing perspective. So we really are fighting a very difficult battle. And as I say, the disinformation is more appealing than the truth. If someone writes that the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau left his job as a drama teacher at the Fort Grey girls' school because of sexual misconduct, it's much more appealing than the truth, which seems to be that he just got bored and decided to quit. And once the false allegation is made, the taint of the false allegation always continues to exist, even if it's completely refuted. And so I really think that this is a serious, serious problem, and I really don't know what we can do. I mean, people in Canada talk about let's ban WeChat, but it really isn't practical. For one thing, I couldn't communicate with all of my former classmates and friends in China without WeChat. I mean, there is no other means to contact people except for that. So I don't know what the answer is. I really, but I think there again, it is a question of are we putting enough resources into trying to counter China as best we can, and clearly we are not.
Right. Well, that's a little depressing.
Oh, sorry, Martin.
Yeah, we still have some time for more questions. So there's. Yes, please. Microphone. Oh, okay.
Hi, it's Florindo Chivucut from Friends of Angola. I was just wondering, is the Chinese and the Russians are using democratic principles and free market to undermine democracy? If yes, how can you counter that?
George Kennan had a way to counteract that. So he wrote the long telegram in 1948. He looked at what he was writing it from Moscow, and he was a US State Department official who understood the challenge of what the Soviet Union was ramping up, which, I mean, they'd already been engaging it in the 20s and 30s. but on a much grander scale after the end of World War II, the political warfare, and using the open society as Popper wrote the Open Society at my university, actually, Karl Popper. He wrote it in his 7 years as an academic at my university, watching the world from Christchurch, New Zealand. And he wrote about the open society and its enemies, which are the authoritarian states. And our open societies are so vulnerable. But there, you know, when I wrote a paper in 2017 called Magic Weapons, and it described a very dangerous situation in my country, which had a bad case of China's foreign interference. And I wanted to end on a positive note, and it was a really genuine belief that I ended that note was that we have magic weapons in our society. We have more than one, we have more than three. And famously, the CCP talks about their 3 magic weapons. But we have multiple, and we have freedom of speech, we have the right to choose our governments, we have the critic and conscience role of the academic, and so on. So George Kennan was not saying, let's stop democracy, let's pervert democracy in order to deal with the challenge of the Soviet Union. He was saying, let's be clear-eyed about what's coming at us, and let's inoculate our populations, let's talk to them about what's going on, what in those days the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China and Czechoslovakia and the other Eastern Bloc countries were throwing at the West. Let's explain that to our people. Let's put money into academic journals so there'll be good quality critical analysis of the Eastern Bloc and so on and so forth. So that was how, that was the solution back then. And I recommend everyone to go read The Long Telegram. It is a really, really great visionary piece of writing. So that's what we've got to do, is be clear-eyed, and then we have to continue to be who we are. And that's what Karl Popper tells you. He says that you have to be prepared. If you're an open society, there will be enemies, and you have to be strong against that.
So it's Karl Popper and George Kennan. I didn't know that Karl Popper actually wrote it in Christchurch. I thought he was in London at that time.
So in the beginning of this administration, obviously it was right in the middle of COVID, and one of the free markets that I think the U.S. and the entire world woke up to was the vulnerabilities of supply chains. And so here you have economic interdependence, but you have one actor who has decided to exploit that interdependence to be able to stop critical supply chains from whether responding to COVID, but also responding from criticism in many cases to the response to COVID. And so you couldn't actually, it demonstrated you couldn't actually manufacture domestic vaccines without also going through potentially the PRC. And so this administration really prioritized its industrial policy, really being able to bring supply chains back to the United States, while with also our partners and allies, and really focusing on that economic security component, which I think is not a departure from free market, but it's being able to craft it in such a way that it sort of advances U.S. interest. I think we talked a little bit about the media environment and how that is being manipulated by authoritarian actors. It's also important to demonstrate that it's, to your point, one of our few areas of comparative advantage. It's not about weaponizing democracy, but it's realizing that our model of working with civil society stakeholders, working with independent media, working with local actors, that is where the United States and other development comparative model works. The PRC has been pretty clumsy at being able to use that. But the U.S. emphasizes local workers. All of our USAID missions have locally employed staff, and we really, they're part of our teams. They help us create better sustainable models for development, and we sort of also work with the countries that we operate in to really lead their projection towards sustainable growth. I think that's where we have democratic comparative strengths.
Thanks. Well, it often seems to me that we're basically countering the industrial policies that are coming from China with reintroducing our own industrial policies. For a long time, industrial policy was a four-letter word almost, but now it's back almost everywhere, including actually here. Okay, we have a couple more minutes, so please.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I am Phumlani Majosi from Johannesburg in South Africa. My question will be very quick. Firstly, it's very clear that in Africa, China and Russia, they are deeply in, right, with huge influence. Now, my question is, it does seem that the Russia and China approach is that we are going to work with you regardless of human rights or whatever. We are going to sign the deals with you. We are going to cooperate. Whereas Western nations have come through with the idea that, listen, well, we can work with you depending on the nature of human rights, where are you, and all those conditions. And the Chinese and Russia, they come in and do the work. We had the BRICS summit in Johannesburg last year in 2023, the BRICS summit. And, Xi Jinping was seen by many, the president of China, as this giant who's, reshaping the world order by many, in my country and, in other African countries. My question is, how does the West handle this, right? Does it also conform to or choose the way China and Russia are doing things? Just, ignore the human rights, get transactional first? Because I heard another speaker in the previous session saying that, well, look, maybe we need to start slowly as Western nations. Let's not come in with this idea that bring us human rights first. Maybe let's start cooperating first, and then over the long term, we see the idea of human rights coming through after having built that long-term relationship. How does the West handle this? Because it seems like people in Africa, they are willing to say, look, we're going to work with the Chinese and Russia because they don't give us too many conditions, and therefore we'll choose their path. What does the West do here? Thank you.
Thank you. That is, of course, a crucial question. I think the short answer is that the West has been dealing with that badly. What is the long answer? But it cannot be very long because we only have something like...
Can I try?
Yes, please.
So our administrator has a saying that it's not just about getting development done, but getting development done right. So, study after study show that unless you have inclusive development, so development that also takes into account gender inclusion, half the country's population from the outset, the beginning of a development model or project, that's the way to actually have sustainable, inclusive development that actually benefits all aspects of population. So yeah, we might not be the first one to build that road or bridge, but I think our model has demonstrated, and so does the evidence, that in the long term, it gets the development done right.
We build a bridge that doesn't crumble.
Exactly.
But I mean, we're losing, aren't we? I mean, the Belt and Road program enables dictatorships. As soon as you suggest that there should be tolerance for homosexuality in a lot of African countries, they're just, they're not going to respond to that. And I mean, it does come down to, it's similar, I guess, to the information thing where, in Canada, we're trying to counter disinformation by legislation, but the legislation criminalizes, say, suggesting that there should be what you call some sort of ability to make homosexuals not homosexuals anymore, or if someone suggests that the residential schools for indigenous people were not a tool of genocide, that they can be charged and put in prison. So, we're trying to do the right thing, but the consequences could be worse. And obviously, the amount of investment in third world development just is not as effective as the Chinese Belt and Road program, which is targeted and strategic. And I mean, China's prepared to put that money into those countries because of the possibility of getting access to port facilities and other, able to achieve geostrategic benefits. I did do a report on this subject for Canadian Department of National Defence, and you see the most Belt and Road investment and most tolerance of loan forgiveness in places where the country is demographically and strategically well located for future Chinese military bases and turning ports into allowing submarines to come or possible Chinese installations, especially once the country gets in so much debt that they can't pay it back without fulfilling Chinese conditions. So I really don't know what the answer is, but clearly we're losing. I mean, we're losing the third world because we're letting China and Russia win.
I don't want to end on this depressing note. So, does anybody have anything positive to say?
The United States has been investing in public health. In places like Zambia, we reduced the life expectancy by of death by 20% based on public health investments that we've made in the country. A lot of these investments, that story doesn't get out there, but the United States does have a strategic advantage, not in infrastructure, but in other important development places like public health, like supporting democracy, like supporting environmental, conservation, combating IU fishing, and so it is an asymmetrical advantage in terms of who gets credit. But I think the United States is stepping up to the game in a place like Africa, and we're really trying to make a better offer to the global South.
I guess the challenge now is to communicate these advantages properly to people out there.
And leverage our partners and allies.
Right, exactly. So I would like to make this panel one that ends on time. So we're slowly drawing to an end. We are supposed to draw conclusions, 3 conclusions. I only have 2. So one is that we are being pushed back badly, and the other one is that we're just not doing enough about that. Do you think that's a fair conclusion?
Yeah.
So
But to end on a positive note, we know what to do. And we had 2 very good people telling us what to do. Karl Popper was one, and Kennan. Yeah.
George Kennan.
Yeah.
all right.
We know what to do.
That's great last words. So please join me in a round of applause for the speakers.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much.